Hello everyone. I've created this video just to explain through the last stages of completing your assignment. I already went through some of these things on our lesson on Thursday last week, but I just thought I'd put them together to clarify so that if you were away on Thursday or if you just want to kind of go through and hear this again, it's really here to help you. There's a couple of key pieces of information here. The first thing I'm going to talk through is just the assignment and the assessment of the assignment, just so that you know what you're being marked on, which means that you can make sure you're polishing your piece ready to hand up. And the second thing I'm going to talk about is the writer's statement. So if you don't know anything about the writer's statement, or you don't know how to start or anything like that, this video is definitely going to help you out. And you might choose, if you feel okay with the assessment side of things, to skip forward in the video a little bit. So I'm going to be jumping between a few different applications, but at the moment I'm just looking at the narrative sway, and this is right down the bottom. And I'm just starting by drawing your attention to the fact that at the end of this assignment, you will submit to me 4 things. You need to show your narrative mind map and evidence of your peer editing process. We've already talked about this quite a bit. They just need to be in your OneNote. They're not marked, but they are ticked to see that you have shown that competency. So I don't give you an A, B, C, D grade for it. I simply look at the competency of the fact that yes, you know how to plan something, and yes, you have gone through a peer editing process. The 2 things that are marked separately is the final narrative and your writer's statement. So first I want to talk about how they're marked so you know what you're looking for, and then I'm going to talk through the writer's statement. Now, if I duck across to our OneNote, in this section here, I've just clicked on assessment sheets. You can't see this because it's off the screen, but the first thing under assessment sheets, which is under content library, is the narrative investigation. And you've probably seen this one before, or hopefully you have, but this is all of the information about the piece. Okay, so you can see in here, everything is really clear in terms of exactly what you need to do for this assignment. Now, if you go down the bottom, you can see the marking criteria, and you can see across the 2 tasks that I'll mark, there are 4 criteria that are going to be covered. In terms of the narrative assessment, there's 3, and the writer's statement has 1. So I'm going to talk through these just really clearly and carefully, so that just before you submit your work, it might just be worth listening to this again and just making sure that you feel okay about the score that you're likely to end up with. It shouldn't be a mystery. You should know exactly kind of what's coming. So for the narrative assessment, you're marked on 3 things. The first thing is the narrative punctuation. Now this is really about, it says here like the dialogue punctuation, showing the proper layout, proper use of paragraphs and changes for time and location, and it's also just the accuracy of your punctuation and bits and pieces like that. Now, if you've done the narrative punctuation lesson, you should know exactly what I'm looking for. Okay, because that video talks about all of the components that you need to show in your piece. If you have not watched that video and done that question sheet, then you're setting yourself up for trouble here. Okay, because if you follow all of those rules and you're really careful about how you follow them and how you show them, there's no reason why you shouldn't get an A. Okay, so just keep that in mind. The second criteria is about narrative techniques. I'll talk about those in just a second. I'll just quickly make the point that spelling, the work we're kind of doing on spelling, you can see here, if it's flawless spelling, that's an A. Now that's a pretty significant thing to watch out for. You have to really check and really be careful on that. If you've got 1 or 2 visible errors, then you're in a B. If you've got 3 or 5, then you're in a C. So that's a really significant thing, and it is actually really difficult to do that well. Now, narrative techniques, this is kind of the big one, and for this reason, these 2 things, like the narrative techniques up here and the the identification of narrative techniques down here, are very similar. Okay, so I kind of use both of them, even though they're marked separately. So the first thing, narrative techniques, this is the fact that you can use them. And the second one down here is about your ability to identify them. Okay, so if you've used it properly, then you should be able to identify it. Okay, that's kind of what we're really talking about. Now, in terms of narrative techniques, there's 3 main ones that we've talked about in class. Those are characterization, symbolism, and setting. And you can find notes about those in the sway right up the top when we were talking about the boy who cried wolf and everything like that. There's a great handout that explains them, and that'll really help you. Okay, but you need to be able to show that you've used them, and this is sort of where the writer's statement comes in. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking about the writer's statement, and I'll go back and forwards between these 2 sections so that you get a really good sense of exactly how that works. So here we are at the writer's statement. I made the point here that as part of your process, you need to write a statement that summarizes the creative process. This is a really big thing that you'll do in senior school, so you need to know this skill. There's some stuff there to read. I'll let you do that. But it says here you need to outline what you wanted to achieve, how you came up with the idea, how you produced the work, and here's a really important one, what techniques you feel you effectively used. Okay, so you need to be able to talk about which techniques you've used, and you need to discuss them with evidence. Okay, so that is really important because that's the guts of what you're being assessed on in this case. What techniques have you used? Give me evidence. Now down here I've got an example of a writer's statement which really gives you a sense of what you need to do. If I go back to the assessment side of things, you can see here that there's one key thing being assessed in your writer's statement, and that is the use of different examples of techniques. Okay, so if you can give identification of 3 separate techniques that have been used with a relevant purpose in your piece, then you will get an A. If you can only give me 2 examples, you'll get a B. If you can only give me 1 example, you'll get a C, and so on. Okay, so be really aware of that. You should be able to tell me, or as you're reading your own work, you should be able to say, here's an example, here's an example. Okay, to go a little bit closer just so you can see those, okay, identification of 3 separate techniques with relevant purpose and example. Now, when we talk about this idea of purpose, let me explain this to you a little bit more clearly. As part of your story, you were required to have a theme. Okay, so you remember we talked about this at the beginning of the year when we looked at The Boy Who Cried Wolf. The theme was about honesty. Okay, your story should have a theme. Your narrative techniques are used to communicate that theme. All right, so if you don't have a theme, if you can't identify a theme in your story, then you will not meet the assessment criteria. So you need to have a theme. You need to give proof of how you've used narrative techniques to communicate that theme. So I'm going to go through mine here. Now I've given you an example of an A grade, and I'm going to show you where the marks are. I'm going to show you why this is an A, and you should be able to do this same process with your work. Okay, if you want an A, this is what you need to be doing. Okay, so I'm going to make my way through my example and I'm going to explain to you why it's an A grade so that you can be copying what I'm doing and learning from my example. So, for my narrative assignment, I was required to produce a narrative piece of writing that communicated a message or theme through its story. Now, your first sentence could be very similar to that because you had the same thing that you needed to do. Really simple, here's why I'm doing what I'm doing. In order to come up with my idea, I first produced a mind map which allowed me to make some decisions about my story. Now, if I go up a little bit, what am I talking about? How did I come up with my idea? Okay, so it's directly relevant to what's up here. I talked about decisions. The first element I thought about were my characters. Mr. Brown told me that a good short story should not have too many characters, so I decided I'd aim to have 2. So I'm justifying the decisions that I made in the story, and that's really important. I created 2 characters by making a series of small decisions, and this helped me decide that I wanted one of them to be an old man named Terence and the other to be a young boy named Ash. So I've justified my decision. Here's where I start to introduce what my theme is, and here's where I start to give you some evidence as to how I communicated that theme. So as I'm going through here, I'm going to tell you where I'm allocating points and marks. So I tried to think of a setting where these 2 characters might meet. Now you'll notice in this paragraph I'm talking about setting, which is one of the 3 types of narrative techniques that we can use to communicate meaning. Originally I thought that they might meet while waiting in line at a coffee shop. I thought it might be good if the young boy helped the old man somehow and maybe got something in return like a free coffee. I brainstormed this idea and thought that my theme could be about helping others. Okay, so here's my first indication as to what my theme is. Okay, this is why my story is written. This is what it's trying to teach people. You need to do this. I tried to think about why the 2 characters would talk to each other and considered a few ideas to make this happen. When I couldn't think of anything good, I decided to change the setting. So I'm now referring back to the technique. This is the technique. I'm talking about how I use this technique to communicate my idea. I thought I could make Terence more interesting if I gave him dementia, because then he would be in need of help but might not know it. Because of this, I decided he had to live in an old folks home. In order to get Ash into the home, I decided he could be doing work experience. So what have I just done? I've identified in this paragraph what my theme is, which is about helping others. I've identified how I have communicated that, which is through the setting of an old folks home. Like, this is why my story is set in an old folks home, because it links to my theme in this way. So this is one piece of evidence as to how I've used narrative techniques. Okay, so far I'm on a C just from this section. Pretty good. Let's keep going. I used Ash to show how we can help others. Now, in this case, I'm talking about using a particular character to convey my theme. That's characterization. So now I'm hinting at my next piece of evidence. Because in the story, Ash finds Terence trying to get outside, but he ends up distracting him by chatting with him and calms Terence down. I remember once someone telling me that many dementia patients get frustrated with being so confused and that the best thing for them is contact with others. I wanted to make it clear in my story that helping people isn't always easy, so when Ash had to calm down Terence, I described him as being really nervous. So what I've kind of done here is I've now talked about how or why I created this character and what role he plays in my story as a technique. Okay, so this is another piece of evidence that I've used to demonstrate how I communicated my theme. Okay, so now I had one up here and I've got one here. So I'm on 2, which means that I'm getting closer. I'm around the B mark at the moment. What I start to do now is give some really specific evidence. Now, not only does this kind of show a stronger understanding of techniques, but it also reinforces some of the things I talked about in the first part of my statement. Okay, so some of the language I used to show how difficult it was for Ash was when I wrote, I looked at the dirty stains on the strange old man's jumper and considered turning around and walking the other way. I certainly didn't want to get attacked by some crazy old man. I turned to run, my legs primed to move, but for some strange reason I just stood there. I guess I felt guilty. In this section I used Ash to characterize, so notice how I'm bringing in that language. I used him to characterize my theme of helping others, and I used his nerves to show that he had to step out of his comfort zone. Okay, now this information really to a certain extent just adds to what I had above here. Okay, so this makes it really strong evidence because not only did I talk about how I characterized Ash, but I gave some great examples of that. Okay, so this together, I think these make a really strong piece of evidence. So with what I had at the top here and these two sections down here, I reckon I've easily got a B going for me at the moment. If I can add another piece of information or another piece of evidence to show my process and thinking about getting my message across, it'll be an A. So here's my second to last paragraph. During the class editing process, one of the comments I received was that my setting wasn't detailed enough. One student told me that I should include more external description to make the scene come alive. Now, the thing I really like about this is that this draws from the lesson we talked about in terms of forms of communication, external, internal, and dialogue. I'm showing that I'm using this understanding to improve my narrative. For me, the setting was important because it needed to support my theme by showing how people needed help. So here I am, I'm back to the setting, but I'm giving a different example. Before I talked about why I used the setting, and now I'm talking about how the setting was kind of symbolic of needing help. So I'm kind of mixing my approach of setting and symbolism. I wanted the audience to see how trapped and miserable the place seemed to Ash because this inspires him to make a difference. In my final copy, I added to this element by being more descriptive. Originally, I was just talking about what Ash saw, so saying I could see stains on the walls, but I added to this by adding other senses. The room smelled like mouldy cheese, and there was a stale taste in the air that made my mouth feel dry. So what I've done here is I've given really specific evidence about how I have changed and altered the perspective of my main character in order to make my theme clearer. All right, so that in itself is a great piece of evidence to show that I'm using techniques in order to communicate meaning. So with the piece up here, the piece up here about my decision to use a particular setting, the piece here about how I used my character to represent that meaning, and the piece here about how I refined my character and setting in order to make the meaning clearer, I've got 3 really strong pieces of evidence to support my understanding of narrative techniques. I ended the thing by saying whether I thought it was effective and how I could have improved it. And again, if I go up here, this just links to exactly what we've talked about in this section here. I've done all of these things. Okay, so if I go back to my assessment criteria now, you can see that in order to get an A, I needed to identify 3 separate techniques with relevant purpose and examples, and I've done that. I showed my setting and I explained, I gave examples of settings I'd considered beforehand and why they supported my theme. I talked about Ash, the character of Ash. I talked about characterization. I used an example of how I described him, and I talked about how that was relevant to showing my theme. And the third thing I did was I talked again about using more external description to support the message I was doing. I talked about why I did that and the effect it had, and I gave an example of one of the changes that I made. So I've just received an A for my narrative writer's statement. Okay, if you follow the same process, you'll get the same score. Just a closing point to be really aware of is these last points here: relevant, purpose, and example. Okay, if you do not show how the technique supported your message and give an example of it, then you don't get the mark for it. Okay, if you just say, I used characterization, full stop, I used symbolism, full stop, I used setting, you will not get an A. You need to give the purpose and the example. Look, I hope that's really clear, and I hope that this guide helps you to produce the best piece of work you can. If you've got any questions, please make sure you come and see me.